Hey all, welcome back to our continued study on First Peter. Last week we left off on chapter 2, verse 12 is where we stopped. This week we're actually going to go back and start at verse 11 and continue this thought of Peter. The reason we're going to go back to verse 11 is I really wanted to focus in on one of the words that Peter used that I didn't really point out last week. And this section kind of runs, starting in verse 11 in chapter 2, kind of runs through chapter 3, verse 12. And it speaks to what Peter's speaking to for the people is Christian existence and conduct in society. And so it's really important that we focus on this word and what it means through the context of the rest of this. Now I say where this whole thought runs through chapter 3, verse 12. I'm hopeful that we get all the way through it today. Part of the problem is some of the words that are used and some of the ideas and some of the thoughts are really foreign to us today. They might even have negative connotations. And so we need to focus in on what Peter's speaking to in the first century and cross that theological gap to today. And that can be a hard thing. Again, some of the words and ideas that he's expressing have, again, some negative connotations for us today, things that we would push back against. Um, and so I really want to focus on these. And so it might take us, again, longer to get through than I'm expecting. Again, I'm hopeful to get through chapter 3, verse 12. We'll see if we can make it all the way through there. But again, we're going to start this morning or today, whenever you may be watching this, in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11. So here we go. Beloved, I urge you as aliens and exiles to abstain from the desires of the flesh that wage war against the soul. Conduct yourselves honorably among the Gentiles, so that, though they may malign you as evildoers, they may see your honorable deeds and glorify God when he comes to judge. For the Lord's sake, accept the authority of every human institution, whether of the emperor as supreme, or of governors as sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to praise those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing right you should silence the ignorance of the foolish. As servants of God, live as free people, yet do not use your freedom as a pretext for evil. Honor everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. And so the word that I really wanted to focus on, the part that I want to focus on is in verse 11 when Peter starts out talking about live as exiles and aliens, aliens and exiles. Because the word that he's using is less resident alien in meaning, periokos, and more of sojourner or someone who passes through, peripodemos. And and there's a big difference there. So when we think of resident alien in modern parlance, in our thought process as uh, Americans, when we think of resident alien, periokos, we're thinking of someone who has permission to live and work in our society. And so someone who has a green card. And really what Peter's thought is no, you're not really part of society. You're living in that society, but you're not really part of that society. You're more of a sojourner, a person who passes through. So peripodemos. And that thought is that earth is temporary. Our home here is temporary. We look forward to a heavenly home. And so our home here is not permanent. It's not something that ultimately although we live in it, we are not of it. And so that's a very important thought as Christians, looking forward to that heavenly home. And so everything that we do, everything that we say should be pointing to or towards that heavenly home. And so that's just a really important idea that I didn't get into last week and really should should be focusing on, because that's what Peter's focusing on. Um, Peter doesn't say or imply that the real home is heaven, but he is kind of saying that. But he is saying that since our rebirth, since we have been reborn in Christ, we are a new people group, and thus we're resident aliens wherever we are. So whether it's first century Rome, Greece, Turkey, Asia Minor, or 21st century America, North America, wherever you may be watching this, we're resident aliens wherever we are. And so we speak to being part of society, but ultimately our home, our identity is wrapped up in Christ. So our allegiance is wrapped up in Christ. And so Christ comes first wherever we are, whether we're American or Hispanic, Mexican, or um, Greek or Roman, whatever. Our allegiance first is Christian, and so our identity first is Christian. And so these verses that we're getting into here, and like I said, it's an idea that it's going to run from verse 11 in chapter 2 to verse 12 in chapter 3, and actually it runs to the even chapter 5, verse 5. But all these verses speak to accepting authority or being subordinate to. The preeminent thought, though, the word that's used to express this being subordinate to, is hypotasso. And so that hypotasso really means to order something below something else, or to set yourselves under. And so these thoughts of being subordinate to, Peter's not saying that we need to obey all of these institutions unquestioningly. What he's saying is that God has put things in a certain order here on earth. And so these institutions that are set up by man are, in essence, ordained by God. God allows them to happen. If God did not allow them to happen, they would not happen. And so the order is much like the order of everything else that we see around us, the order of the universe, the order of the earth rotating the sun, the order of the moon rotating the earth. All of these happen because of order. And so natural law, which has been set up by God, happens for a reason. Well, these institutions, which have been set up by man, have been allowed by God, and again, happen for a reason. And so there's that order. And order plays a part in the entire universe. And so this first section speaks to our relationship with the emperor, our relationship with the governors. In modern words, again, that would be our relationship with our government, our relationship with our institutions. And how do we as Christians interact with that? How do we become part of that? Some Christian thought is that we shouldn't really listen to the government at all. And that's not what Peter's saying. Peter's saying that in all of our actions, we need to respect the government. We don't have to agree with them. We don't have to obey unquestionably, but we do have to respect the government. We have to respect the office. We have to respect the institutions. We have to respect the laws that are set forth. Again, we don't have to agree with them, because we don't agree with every law that comes down from government. We do have to respect the institutions and what they're there for. But again, not something that we always agree with. And up to this point, Peter has focused on Christianity being a faith that has been lived out. And again, he's continuing that theme. He's continued that theme of, as Christians, these should be our actions. We should love each other. We should love God. and we should respect the authority. And I love how he ends this section in verse 15 when he says, and actually it's verse 17, when he says, honor everyone, which we should do, love the family of believers, and so our fellow Christians, just continue to build them up. At this point, again, in history, Christianity is something that's not widely accepted. It is something that is being persecuted, whether actively or passively. And so we need to build each other up and support each other. Then he says, fear God and honor the emperor. And again, when he says fear God, what he's saying is pay reverence to God. And how do we pay reverence to God? We pay reverence to God through our actions. We show our love to God through our actions, through our words, by what we do. But he says, fear God, honor the emperor. And so those are two hugely different thought processes. Pay reverence to God, but honor the emperor. Honor the office. Live in society by what Jesus has told us. Love God with all that you are and love your neighbor. And how do we love our neighbor? We love our neighbor through action. We love our neighbor with our hearts. We love our neighbor by, taking care of the poor. We love our neighbor by taking care of the widows and the orphans. We love our neighbor by doing things the right way. And if we're showing reverence to God, if we're pointing to God through our actions, then we are honoring the office of the emperor. We're not agreeing with what he says. Again, we're not, burning incense to the image of the emperor. We're not treating the emperor as God himself. We're treating the office of emperor as the office of leader. In today's parlance, again, it's fear God, honor the president. And again, whether we agree with the president or not, we have to respect the office of the president. Something that I think in today's society we've lost, over the last 20 years or so. We have become so divided as a society that we think this idea of an R or a D behind a person's name defines who they are, when really it's our job as Christians is to respect the office. We don't have to agree with a person. We don't have to necessarily like what they say, but we do have to respect the office. Which leads us into another hard concept for us to really wrap our heads around. So this next section, verses 18 on, speak to an example of Christ's suffering. But some of the words that are going to be used are hard for us. They bring up images that we aren't really sure how to deal with. And so we're going to start in verse 18 here, chapter 2, verse 18. Slaves, accept the authority of your masters with all deference, not only those who are kind and gentle, but also those who are harsh. For it is a credit to you if, being aware of God, you endure pain while suffering unjustly. If you endure when you are beaten for doing wrong, what credit is that? But if you endure when you do right and suffer for it, you have God's approval. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When he was abused, he did not return abuse. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that, freed from sins, we might live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were going astray like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls. So let's stop there for a moment and discuss that word slaves that Peter has used in this section. And he addresses slaves. Now, Typically, I will use the word servants here because Peter addresses servants using the less common Greek word, which is oikotes. Um, and the term was nearly synonymous with the word doulos, uh, which was common in the New Testament, and again, it was the common New Testament word for servant. Um, but oikotes suggests a nuance of service within the household, but both terms, oikotes and doulos, were translated as slaves, servants, slaves. There is a difference, but our understanding of the word slave is very narrow. It's very limited. It's limited to what happened in America in the 17 and 1800s, and so it's kind of marred by that. And that's not what Peter's first century understanding of a slave was. A lot of times in the first century, slaves were not uneducated help. They were paid staff, paid household staff, because a lot of times they were doctors, they were nurses, they were teachers, academic people who taught the children. Um, and so, again, our understanding of that word is fairly limited and it's really negative, and understandably so. But, we see somebody like Joseph in the Old Testament who was a manager of a household, and yet was a slave. He was entrusted with, you know, overseeing the rest of the staff. Um, and so eventually slaves could even buy their freedom with the money that they earned. And so it was almost this idea of indentured servitude. Um, and so if we look at it that way, we kind of have a different understanding. Even in Roman government at the time, there was a lot of legislation regarding the treatment of slaves. Um, and again, I use the word slaves, but it's more servants. Um, people who were paid for their services. Um, and again, their service was involuntary. I mean, it wasn't as if they were hired. It wasn't as if they went through HR and got a job in this household. A lot of it had to do with the Romans when they conquered civilizations. They brought back these people, and these people were bought. Uh, you know, or sometimes they were simply born into this, um, and so they were held at lower esteem. So, what does this mean for us today? You know, so for us, again the word servant. We live in a society where we work and we live and we work for bosses. We work for corporations. But again, it's doing what is right on our jobs, doing what is right for our supervisors. We may or may not agree with our supervisors all the time. We may or may not agree with the corporation that we work for. But ultimately, everything that we do should be pointing towards God. Christianity is a lived faith, and it's a faith that is not an accessory. I spoke to this past Sunday in our church and the Sunday before last. You know, Christianity isn't simply like a handbag that matches an outfit. Christianity isn't simply a pair of earrings that match an outfit. Christianity is fully who we are. It should be fully who we are. And so even in our work life, we should be living out our faith by what we do, what we say, how we act, how we interact with customers, how we interact with patients, whatever our work life is. Christianity should be part of that. And people should be able to say, yeah, that person follows Christ by how we express ourselves. Um, and so when Peter's talking to servants and saying, hey, you endure um, suffering even when you do right, that's something that can point to God. We can sit here and say, yeah, I'm a Christian. I act this way because of what I believe. I do these things because of what I believe. And so people should be able to point to us and go, okay, yeah, you know, they're a Christian. Even when things are not good, even when things are, you know, people are saying, oh, you need to do this or you need to do that, and you accept those things or do those things without complaining about them. It's because of your faith. I I fully believe that our faith lived out has widespread um, ramifications. Our faith lived out, has the ability to change those around us. And if we're consistently, showing our faith in our words and our actions and in what we do, then in good times and in bad, people are going to notice that, hey, that person's on a pretty even keel. Why is that? And it's because ultimately we believe we are sojourners. We are people passing through this world. And everything that we do and say points to our belief in our heavenly life. What's going to be coming about. And so we get through that section and we get into uh, chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. And sometimes this can be difficult to hear, but it kind of like, again, the word slave. We're going to see a different understanding of first century and 21st century. So, verse 3, or chapter 3, verse 1. Wives, in the same way, accept the authority of your husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won over without a word by their wives' conduct. When they see the purity and reverence of your lives, do not adorn yourselves outwardly by braiding your hair and by wearing gold ornaments or fine clothing. Rather, let your adornment be the inner self, with the lasting beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in God's sight. It was in this way long ago that holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves by accepting the authority of their husbands. Thus Sarah obeyed Abraham and called him Lord. You have become her daughters as long as you do what is good and never let fears alarm you. So we'll stop there for just a minute because we got to dig into this. We do. Um, and so what's Peter saying here? Um, and part of the issue is that, uh, for again, part of the early church, this was these verses and verses like these were kind of used as a way to keep women um, in the background, to keep women behind the scenes. And that's not what Peter's saying here. A lot of people will stop at this section and not get into husbands in the same way. Show consideration for your wives. They won't get into that section. So what is this saying about women in general, and wives specifically? Um, what it is saying is that again, it's this continuation of how Christians should live in society. Um, and again, it's not about obeying unquestionably. That's not what is being said here. What Peter is saying is that as Christians, what is your responsibility within society at large, within the government, within your relationship with those that you're married to? And so what Peter's saying here is that wives in the same way accept the authority of your husbands. Again, accept the authority, but don't accept it unquestionably. Accept your role in society, but again, don't accept it unquestionably. First century women actually had, or Roman women had a lot of rights. They could own property. They could, own businesses. And so it's not women, they could even vote. Um, so it's not as if women had no power or had no authority. Uh, but again, within the household, they had certain roles that they played. Same thing for men. Within first century society, men had certain roles that they had to fulfill. Um, but ultimately, even in our personal lives, even in our relationships, we should be pointing to God. And that's what Peter is specifying here. In everything that you do, point to God. Now, in verse 3, when he says, "Do not adorn yourselves outwardly by braiding your hair and wearing gold ornaments or fine clothing, rather let your adornment be the inner self with the lasting beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit." What he's talking about here is some of the um, rituals that were performed at the temples to honor other gods, little g gods, required women to dress in a certain way. And so to take part in these festivals, to take part in these rituals, you had to wear specific clothing and you had to dress in a certain way. And so what Peter's saying is, look, God doesn't require that. It doesn't matter what you wear. It doesn't matter what you look like. What matters is in your heart. And so let your adornment be your inner self. What he's specifically pointing to is, God knows what's in your heart. So don't get caught up in dressing like somebody else. Don't get caught up in having to wear these certain things and clothes in order to be acceptable to God's little g. Um, Understand that God, the one true God, knows what's in your heart. So don't worry about what the outside looks like, because God knows what the inside looks like, and that is very precious to God. Um, and so don't get caught up in societal norms, what society says you have to dress like or look like. Um, be caught up in what's in your heart. Be caught up in your relationship with God and your relationship with your faith. Um, and again, everything that you do and say should be pointing towards God. So, verse 7, husbands, in the same way, show consideration for your wives. In your life together, pay honor to the woman as the weaker sex, since they too are also heirs of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing may hinder your prayers. So he's kind of short on what he tells men here, but let's break this down a little bit. Paying honor to the woman as the weaker sex. Now, uh, this again, 21st century pushes back on this again. It's like, wait a minute, what do you mean the weaker sex? And I'm here to tell you, women are as equally capable uh, emotionally, spiritually as men. They can do all the things that men can do. However, men and women are created differently. Physically, we're created differently. Men tend to carry more muscle mass. Women tend to carry a higher percentage of adipose tissue in their bodies, so fat tissue. And the reason they do that is because they are able to give birth. They are able to feed and nurture a child. Men are not able to do that, not capable. We are designed this way. We are designed this way because men are supposed to protect women. Men are supposed to provide for women. Now, can women have jobs? Heck yeah. Can women work, in every field that men can work in? Yes, they can. Um, are they as physically strong as men? In 99% of the case, no, they're not. And that's just the way we're designed. It's not that, women are necessarily weaker in law or medicine or any of those. No, they're not. Will they work different in heavy construction? Yeah, they will. because men's bodies are designed that way. And so these historically, these verses have been used to attempt to subjugate women, and that's not what Peter's saying. He's not saying that women should be subjugated, period. Women have a role to fill in society. Men have a role to fill in society. And as husbands and wives, they should honor each other. We should lift each other up. We should build each other up. And husbands should protect their wives. Husbands should provide for their wives. Wives should love their husbands. But again, it's not obey unquestionably. If a woman is married to a bad man, they should not subjugate themselves to that. They should not obey unquestionably. If a husband is married to a bad woman, they should not subjugate to themselves. They should not obey unquestionably. This is a mutual relationship that First Peter is talking about. Loving one another, building each other up, and filling the roles that God has for men and women to fill. And so, that's kind of a difficult discussion because we have these ideas of what these words mean, and we don't look too deeply in them because they've been translated for us. But sometimes the translations aren't necessarily the thought that the author was trying to get across, because we have first century meanings and 21st century meanings, and sometimes those don't necessarily come across as well 2,000 years later as they did 2,000 years earlier. So when they're originally written, this is what this means, and this is what society's understanding is. And so it can be difficult when we get to some of these discussions to say, okay, Peter's not misogynistic. Peter is not saying that women can only do this or only do that. No, that's our understanding of what he's saying. But when we go back and look in context, what's being said, this is what is being said. You look in churches today, and women fill so many roles and do so much. They are more than capable of filling those roles, and they are more than capable of doing these things. So yes, they may be physically weaker, just because of how bodies are designed and how muscle mass is distributed and how adipose tissue or fat tissue is distributed. But it doesn't make them any less important at all. So we're going to stop right there. Whew, that was a lot for 30 minutes. But if you have questions, if you aren't sure that what I'm saying is even correct, please put it in the comment section below and let me know, hey, James, I have a question about this. I don't understand what you're saying here, and you need to clarify it. I'll be more than happy to. I'll be more than happy to take the time to write. I'll be more than happy to make a whole nother video on it. Again, it's trying to understand the Greek and translate it into English with the same meaning, with the same first century meaning. And sometimes that just doesn't come across as well as we would like it to as theologians. And so we have to dig a little bit deeper into the text, dig a little bit deeper into the history to give us a fuller understanding of what is being said. So again, if you have questions, if you have comments, if you have concerns, please, put it in the comments section below. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Bible studies tend to be more back and forth, tend to be more questions. So when they're in person, people are able to ask questions. Feel free to ask those questions, and I will do my best to explain them. Until I see you again next week, good luck. God bless. I hope and pray that you are blessed by this Bible study. I hope and pray that it helps your understanding of what's being said here. And I hope and pray that you continue to watch. Have a great day.